Good evening. You are watching a ThinkTech global broadcast. This is the show Asia in Review, and I'm your host, David Day. We are coming at you from Pioneer Plaza at the corner of downtown Honolulu. And you can always join the conversation throughout the show by calling us at area code 808-780-9254. That's 808-780-9254. Our program today is called Secrets for Negotiating Life, and before I get to that, I just wanted to send a heartfelt shout out and best wishes to our men and women in the armed services who are struggling in the Leyte Gulf, Tacloban area of the Philippines. As many of you know, there has been an enormous typhoon disaster there, and the George Washington Strike Force has arrived there today to support the efforts of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Forces. That is a massive, massive disaster, and we wish our men and women of the armed services all the safety, Godspeed, and health possible, and our heart goes out to the people of the Philippines for this enormous tragedy. Moving into our topic today, our special guest is a dear friend of mine, Professor Jeswald Salacuse. And Professor Salacuse, welcome to Asia in Review. It's nice to have you, even though you're there in the cold, dark of night in Medford, Massachusetts.
Well, thanks for the invitation, David. Great to be with you.
For those of you who may not know of Professor Salacuse, he is, in my mind, the senior statesman and guru for the subject of negotiations. He is a former dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He teaches negotiations at the Fletcher School now. He is also a former dean of the SMU, Southern Methodist University Law School in Dallas, Texas, and visiting professor at Harvard Law School. And I don't want you to come to the impression that Jess is just an academic, because he's, in his career, has been a Wall Street lawyer, and he has also been a consultant to multinational companies, government agencies, international organizations, universities, foundations, and foreign governments. And he is a prolific thinker and writer on the topic of negotiations. And as you know, this show, Asia in Review, one week we address the topic of international business, and the next week we do foreign policy and national security. So today we're going to talk about the negotiations aspect of business. And I want to show those of you in the audience some favorite books of mine that Jess has written in the past. This first one here is called The Global Negotiator. Well-respected textbook for business students and law and diplomacy students taking negotiations. Here's another one that has dear to my heart. It's called The Art of Advice. And for those of you who give advice, I would recommend that you grab this book. Here's another book Jess has written. I'm not going to show you all of them because he is a prolific writer. Making Global Deals, kind of a how to do it. And finally, a very special book that has just been released that I think is the crown jewel of his career. It's called Negotiating Life. And we want to talk about this book, Negotiating Life, and I'll ask Mr. Producer, could you put up the cover jacket so our audience can see what that looks like? Jess, this book is going to be available in paperback coming up relatively soon, is it not?
Yeah, December 5th.
Okay.
It'll come out with Palgrave Macmillan. The paperback edition is December 5th.
All right. Before we get into negotiations, Jess, one of the things that you have probably heard people say that, let's talk about economics first, that the laws of economics are kind of like the laws of gravity. That is, you ignore them at your peril. Yes?
Yeah, sure. I would agree with that.
Okay. Now, Now let's go to the field of negotiations. This is a big mystery to a lot of people, a magic black box, if you will. And one of the things that I think that your book, Negotiating Life, really does for the business person or for the average individual in the street is it opens up, fillets open this black box. And you know, I want to get your reaction to this comment.
Well, that's what I set out to do. When we think about negotiations, we think about high stakes diplomacy. We think about Jimmy Carter mediating between the Israelis and the Egyptians. My view is that all of us are negotiating constantly every day. So in a sense, we are all daily diplomats. We are making daily deals. We're negotiating with our spouses, with our children, with our friends. And what I feel is that some of the same principles that apply in high stakes negotiation apply equally in negotiations that we engage in every day. And that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to set out how this whole process of negotiation, from the original decision that you have to make as to whether to negotiate or not, till the final where you've got an agreement and now you have to work to implement it. And I think some of the same principles apply.
Well, you know, what I was getting at earlier is that there are laws of economics, and they work whether or not we follow the laws or not. They're there. And shifting over now to the field of negotiations, I guess what you're really saying is that there are principles or laws of negotiation that...
Yeah, I would say principles rather than laws. I think there are principles to help guide anyone in negotiating more successfully and trying to achieve their interests. For example, I think it's very important to think about interests, that the parties all have interests. That's what drives us. We often talk about our positions. That's what we tell the other side. Right. I want this. And I think one of the guiding principles is to try to look beneath that, to try to understand, well, what are the basic interests? What do you want? Because often you can, positions lock you into only doing a thing one way, and it's very hard to get agreement. But if you start understanding interests, then you see that there are often different ways in which to satisfy those interests.
You know, what's remarkable, Jess, about your work is that you can take the high-flying negotiations representing the Ford Foundation in the Sudan and translate that so that the principle applies to maybe a boyfriend and a girlfriend negotiating at a Starbucks.
Yeah, I think I give the example in the book. I was negotiating in the Sudan to open up in Sudan to establish the Ford Foundation's office many years ago, and everything was going well with my Sudanese counterpart. Until he said, well, what else do you need? And I said, well, we need a complete exemption from all taxes and tariffs, customs duties. And the smile on his face disappeared very quickly because he said, I don't know whether we can do that. We've never done that before. So I had to try to find a precedent for him. And as it turned out, we had made a similar agreement with Egypt. Once he understood that Egypt had given us the same privileges, he felt more comfortable not only in accepting the idea himself, but also I think he felt more comfortable in going to his boss, the minister, foreign minister, to get that approval. And I gave him a copy of the text that we had signed with Egypt, and that helped him seal the deal. And I think the same thing, often it's looking for a precedent that in the past that can help us negotiate and persuade. Anytime you're negotiating, you're trying to take somebody to a place they haven't been. And having some sort of precedent, having some sort of example, concrete example as to how it was done successfully can be very helpful.
You know, that example that you just gave about negotiating with the Ford Foundation brings to mind a rather remarkable chapter in this book that is just chock full of incredible advice for the business person or the average guy in the street who has to negotiate with governments, and some special tools and advice that you provide in this, I think, just very invaluable. And I'd like you to just to kind of comment a little bit with our viewers and give them a couple of examples of these tools on how to work with the almighty, the all-powerful government, and because you do make the point very effectively that it's possible to negotiate with the government.
Yeah, I think often, well, first of all, governments sometimes, when I say government, I'm not only talking about the government in Washington, it may be your local town council that
Sure.
where you have to go to get a building permit. Often governments don't like to use the word negotiate because that sounds like making compromises, and governments aren't supposed to compromise. So for one thing, you might simply refer to what you're doing as discussions or seeking answers or seeking information. Often bureaucrats are more comfortable doing that than than acknowledging that they're involved in negotiations. I think secondly, you really need to prepare. Try to understand how previous decisions have been made in that particular office. There again, once you've got a precedent that has been established, governments feel much more comfortable in following that precedent rather than striking out alone. You know, it's the old adage that when you're negotiating with governments, you don't want to do anything new because they're not comfortable with that. So I think also you have to understand that what's driving governments often is our interests, but they are what I would call political imperatives. They're often concerned about the political appearance of a particular decision that's being made, and they're concerned as to whether or not that decision is defensible to the public or defensible to one's political opponents. So I think you have to try to put yourself in the shoes of the political representative that you're working with, or the bureaucrat that you're working with, and try to perceive how he sees the decision you're asking him to make or her to make, and how to frame it. And I talk about the importance of framing.
What do you mean by framing for those?
Framing is characterizing something.
Okay.
And often you can take the same action and characterize it in an acceptable way, or characterize it in an unacceptable way. And so you need to understand, how do I characterize this? You know, you go into your boss and you say, I want a raise.
Right.
Well, that may not get a very favorable hearing. On the other hand, if you walk in and say, what I really want to talk to you about is a performance review, that may be how you frame your request, as a performance review rather than a demand for a raise. The performance review may get a more favorable hearing than you're walking in and demanding a raise. So again, that's how you frame things, is often a first step. It's the opening move, and one of the points that I make in the book is the importance of thinking very carefully about your opening move, because it can set the path for a constructive negotiation, or it can set the other side's teeth on edge, and they become very defensive.
You know, Jess, when I was studying through this wonderful book that you've written, I was struck by the emphasis that you put on building a relationship and investing the time to cut a deal, and how this almost is antithetical to the American psychology. Americans want to do a deal and get out. And here in the Asia Pacific region, of course, the Asian style of negotiation is, we're going to build a relationship first, whether or not the Americans want to do it, and that involves karaoke and entertainment and all kinds of playing golf and all kinds of things. And when I was thinking about this, one of the things that struck me was how difficult it is for a couple that's in a divorce proceeding to negotiate a business transaction, to create a deal, because they have no relationship. And it just hit me like a bolt of lightning that's why those divorce negotiations are so incredibly difficult, and many of them so unsuccessful.
Yeah, I think that underlying any kind of I don't care whether it's a business contract or any kind of an agreement, is the relationship between the parties. And, you know, I use the example, I'm saying, you know, that just as a map is not a country, a map is a kind of a schematic of what the country's, one thinks the country looks like. A contract is not a relationship. A contract is simply the elements of that relationship, but that contract has to be sustained by a relationship. I think our friends in Asia understand that a lot better than we do, a lot better. We tend to approach, many American business executives tend to approach a deal as a transaction. They think of it as in transaction terms.
Right, right. Well, hold that thought. Just hold that thought. We'll come back to this point because you're on an excellent run here. But we're going to take a commercial break, and we'll be back in just a second.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of ThinkTech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our ThinkTech talk shows. If you didn't know it, ThinkTech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on ustream.tv. Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on ThinkTech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review, our program Secrets for Negotiating Life. Our special guest is Professor Jeswald Salacuse, the former dean of the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy with Tufts University, sitting in Medford, Massachusetts in a cold, dark night there. And Jess, thank you so much for joining us with this show.
My pleasure.
And for those of you who are listening, if you care to join the conversation, you're welcome to call us at area code 808-780-9254. That's area code 808-780-9254. And just right at the break, you were making a critical point about how important it is in order to do the deal to build the relationship. And we were talking about a few ways this is done in the Asia region. And there's an interesting story that you write about, or you talk about, called The Last of the Mohicans, having to do with a relationship. And I'd like you to explain that to our audience.
Well, I do think, I mean, how do you build a relationship? A relationship's a connection. The personal connection of two people feeling they have something in common. And I think it begins with trying to get to know both sides. So as I say, the rule of don't ask, don't tell, which at one time applied in the U.S. military, does not work in building a relationship. It's just the reverse. You should ask, you should tell, you should ask the other side about themselves, and you should be willing to talk about yourself. I'll give you an example. And this was at the Reykjavik summit, when the Reagan administration was encountering the Gorbachev administration for the first time. And the two sides really didn't know each other. And a very early part of that, George Shultz, our then Secretary of State, met Marshal Akrameyev, who was then Deputy Minister of Defense and was one of the World War II generals, one of the great generals of World War II in the Red Army. And Akrameyev said to Shultz, I'm the last of the Mohicans.
Wait, hold on. The Russian general said to George Shultz, I am the last of the Mohicans.
Yes, and Shultz just said what was astounded like you were, and said, oh, what do you mean by that? And Akrameyev said, well, I'm the last of the World War II generals that's still in service. And Shultz said, no, I don't mean that. Where did you get this last of the Mohican stuff? And Akrameyev said, well, when I was a boy, I loved the novels of James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans. And in his memoir, Schultz says, when I heard that, I knew this was a man we could deal with. This is a man who knew something about us, a man with whom we could talk seriously. And a relationship did develop. It was a professional relationship, and it actually turned out to be a professional, a personal relationship. I happened to be at a meeting with George Schultz after he left, and I said, I love that story about you and Akrameyev. He said, oh yeah. He said, after we both left service, I invited Akrameyev to San Francisco, and I showed him around. So there was a continuing connection between the two that just started with that very, very kind of innocent statement by Akrameyev as the two men were trying to get to know one another.
And that relationship, that connection might never have happened if the two negotiators followed kind of the standard advice of pundits that, you keep all your cards close to your
right.
chest, you don't play anything, you don't tell them anything, you're a closed book.
That's right. You play or you play hide the ball. If Akrameyev hadn't said that, there would have been nothing. Or if Schultz had ignored it, or just passed it off and just tried to do business or start a diplomatic conversation, but it intrigued Schultz. There was a connection being made, and that led to, I think, a productive professional relationship. And I think the same is true with all of us. I think that if you're thinking about how do you build a relationship, I think first of all, you got to be ready to invest time. And second of all, I think it's very important that you get to know the other side and let the other side get to know you. And these are the elements of building that relationship, which I think is so essential. It's very interesting. I did a research. I asked about 400 negotiators, when you go into a transaction, when you go to a negotiation, what are you trying to do? What's your goal? Is it a relationship or is it a transaction, is it a contract?
Right.
And about 50% of the Americans said contract. But when I asked this, I got the same response from my Indian respondents. 2/3 of them said, almost 70% said relationship, and contract was secondary. And if I could just carry on this one thing, a lot of the students of gender say women care a lot more about relationships than men. And that's what I found. 2/3 of the American women responded to that question. Going into a negotiation, my goal is a relationship. 2/3 of American men said just the opposite. So it may well be that if you're looking for a negotiator to go out to Asia to negotiate, maybe it's better to send a woman than a man.
How do you convey this point to American business people, that they're going to have to not just race into the airport, jump off the plane, try to get an MOU, and that's their deal, and jump back on the plane? And how do you teach or get these executives over this time is money psychology that we have in our culture in order to build that kind of a relationship?
Well, I tell them horror stories. You tell them about failed deals where the parties were rushing too fast to sign that contract, hadn't laid the groundwork for a long-term transaction, and make them see that one of the reasons that deal failed was the fact, or it had to be renegotiated, was because the parties hadn't spent the time in trying to build a relationship. That's one of the ways I do it. And you try to make them see. I think for a lot of folks, they think about negotiations just getting the contract, and you try to make them understand that you're talking about, particularly where there's a long-term connection, say a long-term investment, right, that it's got to be more than the contract. The contract is simply a piece of paper, and it's what sustains it. What gives it reality is the relationship between the parties. And I talk about my own research I get with experienced American negotiators. I used to do a seminar with the Harvard program on negotiation called Building Better International Relationships. And the message I heard from experienced American negotiators is we spend a lot of time negotiating the contract. But when it's all over, we put the contract into the drawer. And what really matters in dealing with our partners, our foreign partners, is the relationship. And the only time we really think about taking the contract out of the drawer is when we get into a serious conflict and we're thinking about going to arbitration or to court.
Right. Let's shift to a slightly different topic here now. I think you know, it's important that we talk a little bit about this whole concept as a negotiator, whether you're negotiating with a wife, a spouse, a girlfriend, or a potential multinational partner, or a foreign government, in speaking with the right voice, the communication skill of a negotiator. And this, you know, a lot of people say that no, negotiators are not made. They're born like this. They just have this natural ability. And how about can you help our audience understand this? What does it mean to speak with the right voice as a negotiator?
Yeah. Well, I picked that up from Walt Whitman, who said in Leaves of Grass, whoever speaks to me in the right voice, him or her I shall follow. And what that says to me is that whoever speaks to me in a voice, speaking to me as an individual, speaking to me and understanding my particular interest, is someone I am persuaded by. Because negotiation is really so much as communication. It is not, it's right. How you communicate effectively, how you convince people. And I think that you need to be thinking about that all the time. Am I communicating in a way that they truly understand, that they're truly persuaded?
Well, how do you convince somebody?
Well, I think first of all, you got to be convinced yourself. Lyndon Johnson, when he was in the Senate, was really a great negotiator, and really was Joseph Caro's books called that volume was called Master of the Senate, and he was. And one of the reasons he was a Master of the Senate was he was a master negotiator. And he said, he kept saying, he said that what convinces is conviction. You yourself have to be convinced. And Caro talks about how in preparation for negotiations, Johnson would really try to convince himself of the position and kind of work through in scenarios. So I think, first of all, you have to be convinced. Second of all, you have to find the right frame. How do you convince somebody of the right frame to characterize it? We talked about that previously. Right. Often, I talk in the book about metaphors, and I had a very interesting, again, for our friends in Asia. I remember this 15 years ago. I was having a conversation with a deputy minister in Laos who said to me, as he was trying to explain the geopolitical position of Laos, he said, "We are a yam between two boulders."
A yam between two boulders.
And the two boulders are, on the one hand, Thailand and Vietnam, and there's small little Laos in between. So that was a very graphic metaphor, and it really stuck in my mind. So I think that often it's very helpful if we think carefully about not only how we characterize it, but we often use metaphors as a way of persuading, and where you're trying to compare a situation to another phenomena that you hope your counterpart understands. So I think that there are different techniques that one can use as part of that. Questions. What always gets me is that many negotiators don't like to ask questions of the other side.
But there is enormous power in asking a question, is there not?
Absolutely, and questions serve many purposes. One is to get information. Two is to build a relationship. Schultz said to Akrameyev, "Well, what do you mean by that?" Again, questions engage somebody. It engages somebody's mind. So I think the well-phrased question and the well-placed question can be very, very powerful as a way of connecting, as a way of persuading. So a doctor friend of mine said, I got tired of telling people, stop, take care of your health, stop smoking, lose weight. So he said, I started asking questions. and I would ask them, you know, what would it do? What can we do to get you to get on a weight program, or
right.
what do you think we might do in order to help you stop smoking? And he found that they, instead of resisting him, it was a way of engaging his patients, and he felt the results were much better.
It's also a way of building a relationship, is it not? With that engagement? It's a way of building a relationship.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
we're going to, Jess, I want you to hold that thought. We're going to take another break here. Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching Asia in Review. I am your host, David Day. We're talking about secrets for negotiating life with Professor Jeswald Salacuse of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Medford, Massachusetts at Tufts University. And we'll be back right after the break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel. This is ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting live from the Pioneer Plaza in downtown Honolulu. We raise public awareness about tech, energy, and globalism in Hawaii. Technology is critical to our state. A vibrant tech sector will give us new prospects in the global marketplace and will offer great careers and make our economy more resilient. Streaming live on Ustream and Spreaker, ThinkTech allows its hosts and guests invaluable opportunities to report important events and discuss important questions, and to be heard here in Hawaii and around the world. You can find links to our live streams on thinktechhawaii.com or on our mobile website, m.thinktechhawaii.com. And you can see our archive on YouTube. It's all just a click away. We want to do whatever we can to keep Hawaii relevant, connected, and thriving in the complexity of the 21st century. We hope you will help us in those efforts. Tune in today. This is ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
We're back. You're watching a ThinkTech global broadcast coming to you from the Pioneer Plaza, right here at the core of downtown Honolulu. You can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-780-9254. This is Asian Review. I'm your host, David Day, and we are talking about secrets for negotiating life with a senior negotiations statesman, Professor Jeswald Salacuse, the former dean of the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy in Medford, Massachusetts at Tufts University, and also a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. And Jess, nice to have you with us this show. And for those of you who just joined us, right at the break, we ended about talking about the concept of a negotiator speaking with the right voice. And so we're going to shift topics right now. And Jess, let's talk a little bit about now the burning question that everybody wants to know. Getting the actual deal, getting it done. We've built a relationship where we've gone through some details. What's inside this magic black box of negotiations on how to get the deal done?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. One is how to get the deal done is you try to come up with proposals that are mutually beneficial to both sides. And you've got to put yourself in the position of the other side as well. So I think that it's you've got to come up with a deal that is going to satisfy the other side's interests, at least to a certain extent, as well as your own. The issue of
now, let me stop you right there. You said that you have to come up with a deal that's going to satisfy the other side's interests.
Yeah. Let me give you an example, which is a rather simple example. This is a true story. A man died and left all of his estate. He's a wealthy man in New York City who died and left all of his estate to his two daughters.
Okay.
To be divided equally. And the division of the property went very, very smoothly, very, very cordially between the two sisters until it came to the old man's ring. He had a ring, a large diamond ring that he always wore, and both daughters wanted it. Now, you can't, how do you make a compromise out of that? You can't cut the ring in half. So tensions arose between the two daughters as each one insisted, I want the ring, I want the ring. Finally, one of them asked a very key question. We go back to questions. Why do you want the ring?
Okay.
And the other one said, I want the ring because it's got a nice diamond in it. I thought I'd take a diamond and make a pendant. The other daughter said, oh, That's not why I want the ring. I want the ring because it reminds me of our father. Two different sets of interests. Once they understood that their interests were different, then they began to problem solve. They began to try to think creatively about a way in which they could satisfy their interests. And finally, one of them said, I'll tell you what, you take the ring down to the jeweler, take out the diamond, put my birthstone in the ring, you pay for the whole operation, you can keep the diamond and give me back the ring. And both walked away with feeling that their interests had been satisfied. One said, I got the diamond. The other one said, I got the ring. It's the symbolic representation, the remembrance of my father. It's that interest that I had. So both of them were quite happy. If they hadn't started, if one hadn't asked that key question, why do you want the ring? In other words, what is your interest?
So because their initial position was, the stated position was, I want the ring, I want the ring, I want the ring.
I want the ring, never mind. And if one of them, once one of them asked the question, trying to get behind the stated position, I want the ring, then that led to some creative thinking and some creative problem solving. If they had stuck with their positions, and neither one had budged, or neither one had shown the flexibility of asking some questions, they'd still be arguing.
Right, right. So in getting the deal done, is it important to understand causes of potential failure?
I think so. Yeah, I think. Well, that's where you start to ask the what-if questions. You come up with a deal, you come up with an understanding, and now you have to think ahead to questions of implementation. What's going to, and that's what we mean by. Oh boy. Are we back?
Yep.
Okay, because there was a momentary interruption. Yeah, so I think it's. You ask the questions of the what if questions. What if this happens? What if that happens? And you discuss it. A way of trying to deal with failure is to try to anticipate failure and discuss it with the other side. There are different techniques. I mean, I talk about the end game, and there are two aspects to the end game in a negotiation. One is closing the deal.
Okay, and that's what everybody's concerned about. Just close the deal.
Just close the deal. And I think there are often different techniques that you can use. One is to use deadlines. Parties are talking. One side is just content to keep talking, and the judicious use of deadlines can, I think, focus their attention. So I think that's very important. Sometimes dividing the issues. Trying to get a deal on or an agreement on one portion and leaving the other portion, maybe the hard portion, to be dealt with later, is another way of getting a deal. So of closing the deal. But I think it's very important to remember there's a second aspect to the end game, and that's actually getting the deal implemented. I mean, what we want is not just an agreement. We want a change in behavior, or we want desired behavior from the other side. That I get the ring, or that she gets the diamond. Right. And so you need to be thinking about what's the likelihood of implementation, and what are the obstacles to implementation. How can we meet these obstacles now before they arise when we're actually trying to make the deal work?
One of the things that you talk about in your book, Negotiating Life, and Mr. Producer, can we put up the cover book one more time, that I think that is very important to emphasize to our audience, is that once you get to the closing, whether or not the deal is going to sustain itself really is measured by the strength of the relationship that's been built through the negotiations.
That's right, and I think that's right. And often I'm critical of businesses where they have a negotiating team that does the negotiation, and then once they've signed the contract, the negotiators go. They have built a relationship during that negotiation. They've gathered information during that negotiation, which would be very valuable in implementing that deal. So there, you need to try to keep those negotiators involved once the deal is going to be implemented. General Motors had an experience, and I was talking to one of their negotiators, where they would have joint venture teams that would go out and negotiate a deal, and then once the deal papers were signed, they'd move on, and they leave the deal to be implemented by somebody else, some other executives. And in General Motors, that was known as throwing the deal over the wall. In other words, they've done the deal, now let's turn it over the wall and let somebody else worry about it as to how to implement it.
Right. And that's also, as you point out, is a recipe for failure.
Yes.
To do it that way. Jess, we're going to take one more commercial break here, and we'll come back. And when we come back, I want to talk with you about the topic of renegotiation. And ladies and gentlemen, you are watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, David Day, and we're talking with Professor Jeswald Salacuse at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. And we'll be back after the break. Stay with us.
I'm Bill Spencer, president of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
We're back. I'm David Day. You're watching Asia in Review. Our conversation this afternoon is called Secrets for Negotiating Life. Our special guest is Professor Jeswald Salacuse, a senior negotiation guru and statesperson with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston, and also a visiting professor with Harvard Law School. And Jess, nice to have you on the program, and on behalf of the whole team here at ThinkTech, I want to thank you for staying up in the middle of the cold evening there in Boston to talk with us tonight. We've been...
Well, it's been my pleasure, David. It's been fun. It's been a great chat with you again.
We've talked right before the last break about getting the deal done and some of the important principles in that, and a lot of times once there's a handshake, you know, the blue ribbon is on the contract, maybe it goes in the drawer, maybe it doesn't, and sometime down the road, you know, we often see this in the Asia Pacific region here, something happens, the deal doesn't work anymore, the prices change, or the relationship is not as strong. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the critical concept of renegotiating a deal that you already put together.
Yeah, and renegotiation is, I think, a topic that it's been a special topic I've written about. I think it's not been something that we've focused on, because if you actually look at negotiating behavior, you realize that a lot of transactions, a lot of contracts, a lot of relationships are renegotiated, particularly when they run up against changes in circumstances.
Right.
I think about the terrible events in the Philippines. Certainly those are going to have, those events of that terrible storm and the aftermath are going to have horrendous effects on all sorts of business deals of all sizes, of all kinds. We don't know what there will be, but certainly there are going to be deliveries that can't be made. There's products that can't be shipped, all sorts of problems. And the parties are going to have to go back to the table and figure out, how do we handle this problem? So in effect, they are renegotiating their relationship in light of these new circumstances. Another reason for renegotiation is often the parties didn't get the deal right in the first place. They didn't really have a meeting of the minds, so that each side, so that it's very clear what they intended and what they understood their deal to be. So often the purpose of renegotiation in that situation is to clarify what the parties really intended.
Jess,
so
let's suppose we have watching this show. We've got a business owner that's in that exact situation that you've just described. What kind of advice would you give them, or what kind of tools can you give that business owner on how to renegotiate the deal? What are the considerations that you
well, I think, first of all, I think renegotiation is a lot easier if you've got a relationship with the person with whom you're trying to renegotiate. And if that person values the business relationship, the long-term business relationship, that person will be more likely to engage in renegotiation than if not, than if there is no such a relationship. So I think that's important. I think it's also important as you approach renegotiation to try to understand the other side's interests and to try to satisfy them. If you can, in the negotiation. Another time is to bring in a third party, a respected third party who can help the two sides renegotiate. You know, if you've lent $500 to your brother-in-law a year ago, and he promised to pay him back in 6 months, and he hasn't paid you back, maybe a respected.
I can relate with this story. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. A respected uncle can help you bring you two together. This is so the appropriate third party can be helpful. I think in many negotiations we see ourselves as locked into a battle with the other side. It's a bilateral battle, we maybe need to break that bilateral model and bring in a third party who can be helpful in bringing across getting an agreement. I gave an example in the book of mediation, not a mediation, but an intervention where Reebok wanted to the shoe manufacturer wanted to renegotiate its contract with one of its distributors, and the distributor absolutely refused. So what Reebok did was to get a non-competing manufacturer whose goods were also being distributed by that distributor to talk with the distributor and make him understand that it was in everybody's interest to sit down with Reebok and try to talk through the problem. So I think the right third party can be helpful.
You know, I noticed a lot of times people who are just pundits, they give all this kind of stereotypical advice about negotiations or entering into negotiations, and one of the ones that I hear the most is you always want to negotiate from a position of strength. And we just have a couple minutes left. I'd like you to kind of close the show, Jess, on that. Let's take that one.
Yeah. I mean, the power is always an issue. I mean, the power is a factor in negotiation. One side's strong, the other side is not as strong. But power is not necessarily determinative. And the question is, what do you mean by power? And I think my definition of power is the ability to influence the other side. Sometimes the size of your war chest or the size of your army is persuasive, but other times a good idea, a good relationship. There are different ways, and that's why I say it's about convincing the other side, persuading the other side. Often a good relationship can help you persuade the other side. Often bringing in a third party into the negotiation can be helpful. I think about the negotiations between Egypt and Israel that led up to their 1979 peace treaty. It was clearly Egypt's strategy to bring the American president Jimmy Carter in because President Sadat at that time believed that there was only one country in the world that had any influence with Israel, and that was the United States. So that third party, that presence of Jimmy Carter at Camp David, was crucial in bringing about the agreement. So sometimes if you got a problem with your neighbor, over the loud music at night, or how they're dealing with the trash, maybe a respected neighbor on the other side of the house can come in and help the two of you work out an arrangement that will bring peace to you and your next door neighbor.
You know, Jess, this has been just an absolutely fascinating conversation. I know that our audience out in the Asia Pacific region here in the Hawaiian Islands, as well as on the U.S. mainland, deeply appreciate this fascinating conversation that you've had with me, but also the educational teaching and insights into that mysterious black box of negotiation. So I want to thank you for taking the time with us this evening. And I'd like to, hopefully we can lure you into participating with us on other shows in the future.
Well, it's been my pleasure, David. And anytime you want to get together and have one of these conversations, just give me a call.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, you have been watching a ThinkTech Global Broadcast, Asian Review. I'm your host, David Day. We've been talking with Professor Jeswald Salacuse of the Fletcher School of Law and International Diplomacy. And we'll be coming back at you live next week, same time, same place. Please have a safe drive home. Good night.